The rumble of the ferry's engine vibrated through Dean's worn boots, a dull thrum against the backdrop of the churning gray water. He stood at the stern, hands gripping the cold metal railing, watching the mainland shrink into a hazy smudge on the horizon. The wind, sharp and carrying the briny tang of the open sea, whipped at his threadbare coat, tugging at the edges of the grief that still clung to him like a shroud. He'd left everything behind: the city's clamor, the sympathetic glances, the suffocating memories that had wallpapered every room of his old life. This island, this inheritance from a grandfather he'd barely known, represented a desperate gamble for solitude, a chance to outrun the echoes of loss that chased him relentlessly. His journey had begun with a sterile, almost clinical interaction at the last point of civilization, a small, isolated border checkpoint perched on the edge of the continent. The official, a stout man with a meticulously trimmed beard and eyes that seemed to take in too much, had scrutinized Dean's papers with an unnerving slowness. Each stamp of the official's hand on the worn ledger had felt like a final severing, a declaration that Dean was passing into a different kind of territory, one less charted, less forgiving. The air in the small booth had been thick with the smell of stale coffee and something metallic, a scent Dean couldn't quite place. He'd felt a peculiar chill then, not from the temperature. From the official's unwavering gaze, as if the man could see the raw wound festering beneath Dean's composed exterior. "Going far, aren't we?" the official had murmured, his voice flat, before waving him through with a dismissive flick of the wrist. The words had stuck with Dean, a quiet premonition. Now, the ferry sliced through the waves, its hull groaning with each impact. The island, when it finally emerged from the low-hanging fog, was less a welcoming shore and more a jagged scar on the ocean's face. Sheer cliffs, bruised purple and gray, rose dramatically from the water, topped by a dense, wind-stunted forest that looked perpetually winter-blasted. A lighthouse, a stark white sentinel, stood vigil on the highest point, its beacon a silent, unblinking eye in the encroaching gloom. The island's only dock was a collection of splintered timbers, slick with seaweed and barnacles. A single vehicle, a battered utility truck, waited, its driver a gaunt, silent individual who simply nodded when Dean approached. The drive inland was a bone-jarring affair, the narrow track little more than a dirt path winding through gnarled trees. The air here was different, heavier than the sea air, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something vaguely metallic and cold, like old iron left to rust. The silence was profound, broken only by the truck's rattling engine and the distant, mournful cry of gulls. Dean found himself leaning forward, straining to pierce the curtain of mist that seemed to cling to everything, his unease growing with each mile. The cottage stood alone, perched precariously on a promontory overlooking a turbulent stretch of coastline. It was a stoic, two-story structure of gray stone, its slate roof encrusted with lichen, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the tumultuous sea. Paint peeled in long, curling strips from the trim, and the small garden was an overgrown tangle of thorny bushes and weeds. Dean could hear the blood rushing in his ears. The driver merely pointed a calloused finger towards the cottage's front door, handed Dean a heavy, iron key, and without a word, turned the truck around, leaving Dean utterly alone. He pushed open the creaking wooden door, and a blast of stale, frigid air met him. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating ghostly shapes beneath white dropcloths. He pulled a sheet from what appeared to be a sofa, revealing faded floral upholstery. The air, though stagnant, seemed to carry a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant, forgotten machine. He dismissed it as the wind whistling through a loose pane, or perhaps the distant roar of the ocean echoing through the old house's structure. Yet, as he moved deeper into the small living room, the hum seemed to intensify, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated not in his ears, but in the very bones of his feet. He paused, listening. Nothing. Only the sigh of the wind and the relentless crash of waves against the rocks far below. He spun around, but there was nothing there, only the peeling wallpaper and the cobweb-draped corners. His breath hitched. It was just an old house, settling. He was tired, jumpy. He told himself this, but the prickle on the back of his neck persisted. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture. The ferry groaned against the rough-hewn timbers of the dock, a final metallic sigh as the ramp clanged down. Dean stepped onto the weathered planks, the mainland now a distant memory, a faint gray smear swallowed by the horizon. The wind here was different, sharper, carrying a metallic tang beneath the salt, a scent of something ancient and cold. He pulled his worn duffel higher on his shoulder, his gaze sweeping over the desolate scene. A single, solitary figure, bundled in a thick oilskin coat, stood hunched beneath a small, ramshackle structure at the end of the dock, the island's designated border checkpoint. The official, a man with a face like wind-scoured granite and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of generations of island solitude, merely grunted as Dean approached. He gestured towards a smudged ledger, a thick, leather-bound volume that looked as old as the island itself. Dean signed his name, the pen scratching faintly on the brittle page, feeling the man's silent scrutiny. There was no warmth in the gaze, only a deep-set weariness, a knowledge that felt too heavy for a simple dock attendant. Dean wondered if the man saw something in him, some echo of his grandfather, or perhaps simply another fool drawn to this forgotten rock. He felt an inexplicable chill, a premonition that prickled the hairs on his arms, as he passed this silent guardian and stepped fully onto the island. The journey to the cottage was a jarring succession of rough dirt tracks, the island's single proprietor, a grizzled man with a rusting pickup truck, navigating the ruts with practiced ease. Dean's lighthouse keeper's cottage, a squat, stone structure, stood sentinel on the craggy cliffs overlooking a churning expanse of slate-gray water. Its lantern, though no longer in use, was a skeletal presence against the perpetually overcast sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and forgotten things. Dean set his bag down, the sound echoing in the stillness. He busied himself with unpacking, trying to impose some order on the chaos of his new life, a cartographer's instinct for mapping the unknown kicking in. The first hint of strangeness came with the tide. Dean, accustomed to the predictable rhythms of the sea from his coastal upbringing, noticed it immediately. The water receded too far, too fast, exposing stretches of barnacle-encrusted rock usually submerged even at low tide. Then, just as abruptly, it surged back, higher than expected, churning with an unnatural violence that sent spray hammering against the cottage windows. He watched it from his small, salt-streaked window, his brow furrowed in confusion. The patterns were erratic, almost malicious, as if the sea itself were restless, agitated by an unseen force. He tried to rationalize it, a localized weather phenomenon, perhaps, or a unique geological quirk of the island. It wasn't merely the howl of a storm, there was something else woven into its fabric. He heard it first as a low, guttural hum, a resonance that vibrated through the very stones of the cottage. They were formless, indistinct, yet undeniably present, carried on the gale. 1,000 indistinct voices, murmuring just at the edge of comprehension, seemed to claw at the glass. He pressed his ear closer, straining to discern a single word, a coherent thought, but it was like trying to catch smoke. Just a breathy, sibilant chorus, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his bones. He attributed it to the wind playing tricks on the old house, the creaks and groans of settling timbers, the isolation amplifying every mundane sound. Yet, the unease gnawed at him. He sought distraction, pulling out a faded map of the island he'd found tucked away in a dusty drawer. As he unfolded it, a small, leather-bound journal slipped from between its brittle pages, thudding softly to the wooden floor. It was his grandfather's. He recognized the distinctive, almost illegible scrawl on the cover. Dean picked it up, his fingers tracing the faint impressions on the cover. He opened it carefully, the brittle pages threatening to crumble. The ink was faded, smudged in places where water had seeped in, but the handwriting was unmistakably his grandfather's. It wasn't a diary of daily life. Instead, it was filled with cryptic notations, strange measurements, and disturbing sketches. Some pages were almost entirely black with ink, as if the writer had been trying to capture something immense and formless. His gaze snagged on a recurring phrase, scrawled in hurried, desperate strokes across several pages, the deep song. It calls. His grandfather had always been a solitary man, prone to eccentricities, but this felt different. He reread the phrase, his mind struggling to process the implications. The deep song. What did it mean? A metaphor for madness? The ramblings of an old man succumbing to isolation? He was a cartographer, a man of logic and reason, accustomed to concrete data and measurable phenomena. Dean gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He was determined to find answers, to map this new, unsettling landscape, even if it meant venturing into territories he couldn't yet chart. The phrase "the deep song" clung to Dean's thoughts like a barnacle to a hull, a persistent, chilling whisper that refused to be silenced. He reread his grandfather's cramped script, the ink faded to sepia, the words a jagged scar across the page. What had his grandfather meant? Not madness, surely. Not entirely. There was a specificity to the fear in the old man's scrawl, a genuine terror that transcended mere eccentricity. He needed answers, and the only place to start was the island itself. The following morning, a thick, milky fog had descended, swallowing the cottage whole. It muffled the crash of waves, transforming the world into a canvas of gray and indistinct shapes. The journey to the small island community hall, which housed the local historical archives, was a crawl through the opaque shroud. The narrow, winding road, usually visible for miles, now offered only glimpses of gnarled trees and lichen-covered stone walls. The air hung heavy with the scent of brine and decaying seaweed. When he finally reached the modest, squat building, its whitewashed walls stained by years of sea spray, Dean felt a momentary relief, quickly replaced by a prickle of apprehension. Inside, the air was still and cool, smelling faintly of dust and aged paper. A single, flickering fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting a pallid glow on rows of shelves crammed with forgotten ledgers and brittle maps. Dean approached a small, partitioned desk marked archives, where a stout, gray-haired clerk sat, spectacles perched on his nose, meticulously filing index cards. "Good morning," Dean offered, his voice sounding thin in the quiet room. The clerk looked up, her expression neutral, then lowered her gaze to a small sign on the desk. "Access to restricted historical documents requires clearance. You'll need to go through the border checkpoint." He pointed a blunt finger towards a heavy oak door at the far end of the room, distinct from the main entrance. "Identification and purpose of visit, please." Dean blinked. "A border checkpoint?" On a small island like this, to access old books? It struck him as absurd, yet the clerk's tone brooked no argument. He presented his driver's license, feeling a flicker of annoyance. After a brief, silent scrutiny, she issued him a laminated visitor's pass and pointed him towards the oak door. "Sign in on the ledger inside. And no photographs." The checkpoint was less a barrier and more a formality, yet it added to the peculiar atmosphere. The room was smaller, lined with metal filing cabinets and ancient wooden shelves. He found a ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle, and signed his name, noticing the last entry was dated almost 20 years ago. He began to search, pulling out heavy, leather-bound tomes and dusty cardboard boxes. He started with general island history, tracing its settlement, its industries, fishing, a brief stint of quarrying. Then, he delved into local folklore, old wives' tales, anything that hinted at the unusual. Hours passed. The sun, if it was even out, offered no warmth through the grimy windows. He found it in a collection of transcribed oral histories, a section dedicated to ancient islander beliefs. The language was archaic, the accounts fragmented, but a pattern emerged. Tales of a sunken city just off the island's most remote coast, a place whispered to be the abode of the old ones. There were mentions of the deep pact. Something less defined. Protection, one entry vaguely suggested. And tribute. The cryptic entries now took on a terrifying clarity. The deep song wasn't a metaphor for madness, it was a ritual, a warning. He copied down passages, sketching crude maps of the purported sunken city's location. The details were scarce, shrouded in fear and superstition, but the implications were stark. His grandfather hadn't been delusional. He had been terrified of something very real, something ancient and hungry. That night, sleep offered no refuge. He was underwater, the pressure crushing, his lungs burning, yet he could breathe. Strange, luminescent currents pulsed around him, illuminating grotesque, unseen shapes in the periphery. He saw flashes of impossible architecture, cyclopean structures draped in algae, rising from the seabed like forgotten monuments to a forgotten god. His eyes adjusted slowly, and that's when he saw it. A soft, ethereal glow emanated from the corner of the small, damp washroom. A patch of something vibrant, almost iridescent, clung to the grout between the tiles, spreading across the porcelain of the sink. Dean stumbled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. He peered closer, his breath catching in his throat. It was algae, unlike anything he had ever seen, radiating in otherworldly luminescence. It wasn't just in the washroom, a faint, similar glow traced the condensation on the inside of a windowpane in the kitchen, and a small, shimmering patch clung to the base of the old stone hearth. The deep song. The pact. The sunken city. It wasn't just in the history books, or in his grandfather's frantic scrawl. It was here, in the cottage, a tangible, glowing manifestation of something insidious encroaching upon his reality. The island wasn't just a place of solitude, it was a prison, and the walls were slowly, inexorably, closing in. The journal had laid bare a chilling truth. Dean's grandfather hadn't been a broken man muttering nonsense, he'd been a sentinel, a terrified custodian of a secret too vast and ancient to comprehend. The idea of a sunken city, a forgotten pact, an entity stirring beneath the waves, it was all too much, yet it resonated with the unsettling atmosphere of the island, the constant, oppressive fog, the unnatural stillness of the air. He reread the last entry, his fingers tracing the faded ink. The hum grows. The water calls. He pushed the journal aside, the leather cover now feeling less like a historical artifact and more like a warning. That night, the cottage felt different. The familiar creaks and groans of settling wood now carried an undertone, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards. He was in the kitchen, making a mug of tea, when he first noticed it. He paused, tilting his head, listening intently. The sound was fleeting, a ghost in the periphery of his hearing, yet undeniably present. He dismissed it as the wind, perhaps, or a loose pane of glass, but the air was still, heavy with moisture. Later, as he washed his face in the small bathroom, he caught his reflection in the streaked mirror above the basin. For a fraction of a second, the face staring back wasn't his. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the distortion vanished, replaced by his own haggard features, eyes wide with a sudden, sharp fear. He splashed more cold water on his face, trying to clear his head, but the image lingered, a corrosive acid on his vision. He told himself it was fatigue, the flickering oil lamp, the tricks of an old, imperfect mirror. The hum returned, stronger this time, a persistent, low frequency that vibrated through the soles of his feet. He walked into the sitting room, drawn by an inexplicable unease. His grandfather's pipe, usually resting neatly in its ceramic dish on the mantelpiece, lay on the floor beside the hearth. It hadn't fallen, it had been moved. There was no draft, no tremor, nothing to explain its displacement. He stared at it, a tremor running through his hand as he stooped to pick it up. Dean's determination solidified. His grandfather hadn't just written about this, he had lived it. He started a systematic search of the cottage, driven by a desperate need for answers, for any clue to what his grandfather had faced, how he had tried to combat it. He pulled books from shelves, tapped along walls, scrutinizing every surface. Behind a loose panel in the study, concealed by a stack of nautical charts, he found it, a small, wooden box, intricately carved with symbols he didn't recognize, ancient glyphs that seemed to writhe in the dim lamplight. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried seaweed, were several objects. A tarnished silver locket, its clasp broken. And a bundle of dried herbs, tied with a thin, brittle cord, emitting a faint, acrid scent that made his nose prickle. These weren't sentimental keepsakes, they were instruments, tools for a struggle he was only just beginning to comprehend. The journal had spoken of offerings and wards. Was this what his grandfather had used? Had he been trying to appease it, or repel it? The hum intensified, a deep, guttural drone that filled the cottage, making the very air feel thick and heavy. The old house groaned in protest, timbers creaking, glass rattling in their frames. He moved to the window, peering out into the impenetrable fog, hoping for a glimpse of the lighthouse beam, an anchor to reality. But the fog was a living wall. And then, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, it parted. Not to reveal the lighthouse, but something else. Something impossible. In the swirling gray, he saw it, a gaunt, skeletal structure, half submerged in the churning surf, resembling a long-abandoned tollbooth or a forgotten gate. He recoiled from the window, the image burned into his retina. It wasn't just the cottage, or his mind, the island itself was warping, revealing glimpses of a reality that defied logic. He backed away, his gaze sweeping the room, seeking a solid point of reference, something familiar. A ripple, like water disturbed, yet there was no liquid. It oozed, stretched, and began to rise, slowly, sinuously, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, elongated and wavering. The hum was a roar now, vibrating through his very bones, threatening to shatter him. It reached for him, slowly, inexorably, a silent, predatory advance. His breath hitched. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. Instinct, raw and primal, finally kicked in. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair with a crash that seemed deafening against the pervasive hum. The noise, perhaps, or his sudden movement, caused the form to hesitate, to retract slightly, its shimmering edges rippling. It seemed to consider him, a vast, ancient intelligence probing his fear. Dean sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably, his lungs burning. He had seen. It was real. And it had almost touched him. He wouldn't be dragged down without a fight. The journal lay open, its brittle pages a testament to a life consumed by a terrifying secret. Dean traced the fading ink, his own hand trembling slightly. The initial shock had given way to a chilling clarity, a terrifying understanding that solidified with each deciphered line. His grandfather hadn't been a victim of delusion, he'd been a warrior, a desperate custodian of a fragile peace. The words now spoke not just of observation, but of action, of a terrible, necessary involvement. He skimmed past frantic entries detailing the entity's awakening, past the terrifying descriptions of its abyssal hunger, and landed on pages filled with precise, almost clinical instructions. Dean's eyes widened as he read of specific moon phases, of tides, of rare seaborne components to be gathered and prepared. A ritual. His grandfather hadn't just watched, he had actively participated in a desperate, ongoing effort to keep the thing dormant, to prevent the deep song from consuming everything. The air in the cottage grew heavy, thick with the scent of salt and decay that seemed to cling to the old paper. Beyond the window, the fog had thickened to an impenetrable wall, muffling the world. Dean could hear the relentless churn of the waves, but now, beneath it, a new sound began to assert itself. The deep song. It was subtle at first, a mere whisper at the edge of hearing, like the grinding of immense, unseen tectonic plates. But as he continued to read, the thrum intensified, pressing in on his skull, making his teeth ache. His grandfather's entries grew more frantic, describing the escalating difficulty of maintaining the pact. The song grows louder, one passage read, the handwriting jagged and strained. It claws at the mind, tempting, promising oblivion. The vigilance falters. The offerings must be renewed, the seal strengthened. I fear the old ways are not enough. A new conduit. Was that why he was here? He rubbed his temples, trying to dispel the pressure building behind his eyes. The words on the page seemed to swim, the ink blurring and reforming into patterns that weren't there a moment before. He blinked, hard, and the text snapped back into focus, but the unsettling feeling remained. Was it fatigue, or something else? The old border checkpoint holds a key, a token of passage. Without it, the final chamber remains sealed. Dean's mind latched onto the phrase. Border checkpoint. He'd seen a ruined structure, half swallowed by the encroaching dunes on the island's eastern side, during one of his initial, less purposeful explorations. It had looked like a customs shack, long abandoned, its windows broken, its timber bleached silver by the elements. Could that be it? The deep song pulsed with greater urgency now, a low, guttural hum that resonated in his chest. He stood, a sudden dizzy spell forcing him to brace himself against the table. He knew they weren't real, not truly. He had to find the checkpoint. And then, the final chamber. The fog outside was a living entity, swirling and coiling, reducing visibility to mere feet. He followed the faint, overgrown path towards the eastern shore, the thrumming in his head growing louder with every step. He found the derelict structure, a skeletal frame against the swirling gray. The old border checkpoint stood silent and foreboding. Its door hung by a single rusty hinge, groaning softly in the wind. There was nothing here but decay. He swept his lantern around, its beam cutting through the gloom. Clutching the key, Dean returned to the lighthouse, his mind racing. Now, he understood. Back in the base of the lighthouse, where the thick stone walls met the bedrock, Dean began to search. He ignored them, focusing on the tactile sensation of the stone, searching for any discontinuity, any seam that felt unnatural. Finally, his fingers brushed against a section of the wall near the old service ladder, a stone that felt slightly recessed, its surface smoother than the surrounding rock. He pushed, he pulled, he tested it with the key. The key was too large for any visible lock. He pressed his weight against the stone, then noticed a subtle indentation, a small, circular depression in the center of the smooth rock. It was the exact size and shape of the key's ornate head. With a surge of adrenaline, Dean inserted the key, twisting it clockwise. A faint, grating sound echoed from deep within the walls, followed by a slow, almost imperceptible shift. Dean raised his lantern, its beam swallowed almost immediately by the profound blackness of the hidden chamber, a crypt beneath the lighthouse, waiting. Dean drove the jeep over the rutted track, the island's eastern side a desolate expanse of shifting sand and wind-stunted scrub. The border checkpoint, a phrase that still snagged at his mind like a burr, was his destination. He remembered the structure from his first days on the island, a skeletal timber frame half buried in a dune, its windows long gone, its purpose a forgotten whisper. Now, it felt like the only place left to go. The old fisherman's cryptic warning, the lighthouse log, the strange symbols, they all pointed to this forgotten demarcation line. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, a determined tremor running through him. He wouldn't turn back. Not now. The jeep finally shuddered to a halt, tires sinking slightly into the soft sand. Before him, the ruined shack leaned precariously, its single, remaining door hanging askew, groaning faintly in the incessant wind. He pushed the door open, wincing as rotted wood scraped against the sand. A collapsed counter lay in splinters, papers long since dissolved into pulp. The old fisherman had mentioned a hidden chamber, a place where the barrier was thin, but where? He knelt, brushing away decades of accumulated grime and sand. With a grunt, he wedged his fingers into a narrow seam and pulled. The board resisted, then groaned, lifting with a wet, sucking sound. Beneath, a black maw opened. Dean hesitated, a primal fear seizing his throat, but the determination, a stubborn seed planted by grief and curiosity, pushed him forward. He pulled another board, then another, until a square opening, wide enough for him to squeeze through, was revealed. The shaft was rough-hewn, carved directly into the bedrock, not timbered. He saw crude handholds, ancient and worn smooth by countless descents. Taking a deep breath, he swung his legs into the opening, his boots finding purchase on the first slippery rung. The descent was long, disorienting. Finally, his feet touched solid ground. The shaft opened into a small, circular chamber, barely large enough for him to stand upright. And in the center, bathed in the faint, sickly glow of his lantern, was it. It wasn't an artifact in the traditional sense, not a statue or a scroll. It was a pool, roughly oval, perhaps 10 feet across, set directly into the stone floor. But this was no ordinary water. It was a viscous, obsidian liquid, swirling with an internal, phosphorescent light that pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He knelt at the edge of the pool, drawn by an irresistible, horrifying fascination. The surface of the obsidian liquid was not reflective, it was absorbent, pulling his gaze inward. As he stared, the pulsing light intensified, and the swirling depths began to coalesce, to form. Then, the vision seized him. It wasn't just sight, it was a full sensory immersion, a horrific download directly into his consciousness. He was no longer in the chamber. He was under the island, under the ocean. He saw the island from below, its foundations eroded, its rock dissolving into a fine silt. And through those fissures, something rose. It was not a creature with limbs or eyes, not in any way he understood. It was a presence, an ancient, vast intelligence that permeated the water, the rock, the very air. It was a consciousness of unimaginable age, alien and utterly indifferent to human life, to life itself. It was the crushing weight of the deep, given malevolent sentience. He saw the island, his cottage, everything he knew, slowly, inexorably being consumed. Not destroyed, but absorbed, transformed. The rock would soften, the structures would melt, the very air would become liquid, all dissolving into the primordial ooze of the entity's domain. He saw himself, standing on the shore, the water rising, not in waves, but as a slow, deliberate inundation. He was becoming part of it, an appendage of its vast, indifferent will, his individuality dissolving into its immense, collective consciousness. He felt his own identity straining, tearing at the seams. He heard a sound, not with his ears, but deep inside his skull, a low, resonant hum, a vibration that promised dissolution. This was not just a threat, it was an inevitability. The entity was not attacking, it was simply being, and its being meant the unmaking of all else. With a gasp, Dean tore his gaze from the pool, scrambling backward, away from the pulsating blackness. He pressed himself against the rough stone wall, heart hammering against his ribs, every nerve ending screaming. The island, his refuge, was merely a threshold. And he, Dean, was caught in the doorway, a pawn in a game played by forces older than time, forces that intended to reclaim their ancient dominion, starting with him. The jeep rattled, its engine groaning against the incline as Dean navigated the winding, rutted track. The island's eastern side was a desolate, lunar landscape, a stark contrast to the craggy cliffs and wild flora near the cottage. Here, the wind whipped fine sand into stinging clouds, sculpting the land into ever-shifting dunes that swallowed the sparse, wind-stunted scrub. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the phrase border checkpoint a barbed hook in his mind. It sounded so official, so definitive, for a place that had always seemed a phantom on his internal map, a forgotten scar on the island's forgotten face. He spotted it then, a gaunt silhouette against the bruised sky. A skeletal structure of rusted corrugated iron and buckling timber, leaning precariously as if caught in a perpetual gasp. It looked like the remnants of a sentry post, or perhaps a customs shed from an era long past, its purpose now utterly lost to the elements. Dean remembered seeing it once, a fleeting glimpse on his first frantic drive across the island, dismissing it as another derelict relic. Now, its forgotten significance pricked at him. This was where the grandfather had drawn his strange, wavering line on the crude map. This was the boundary. He parked the jeep a safe distance away, the engine sputtering into silence. The sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the relentless shriek of the wind. Dean stepped out, the sand crunching under his boots, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. The border checkpoint stood before him, a gaping maw of broken windows and a door hanging by a single hinge, groaning in the wind's embrace. He pushed the protesting door inward. A splintered desk lay overturned, its drawers scattered, spilling rusted tools and brittle, unidentifiable papers. The air was cold, damp, and carried a faint, cloying sweetness, like stagnant water mixed with something vaguely metallic. Dean's gaze swept the small, single room. On one wall, faded chalk lines formed a crude, almost childlike drawing, a circle enclosing a jagged, upward-pointing arrow. Beneath it, a series of symbols he didn't recognize, etched deep into the plaster, seemed to pulse faintly in his peripheral vision. The faint, sweet smell intensified, now carrying an undertone of something acrid, like ozone after a lightning strike. Then, he heard it. Not a sound from outside, nor an echo within the dilapidated structure. Ours. The single word coiled around his thoughts, alien and possessive. His own thoughts, his internal monologue, felt suddenly distant, as if someone else was listening in, or worse, speaking through him. Dean clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound persisted, a vibration more than an auditory sensation, rattling the bones of his inner ear. This wasn't just a distant threat anymore. This wasn't just the island's secret. It was here. It was in him. His reality felt thin, stretched taut, threatening to snap. He was being watched, not by eyes, but by something vast and ancient, something that perceived him as a porous vessel. He scrambled back to the jeep, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped them. The engine roared to life, a blessed mechanical sound, momentarily cutting through the mental static. He needed to get out, needed to escape this place, this threshold where the veil between worlds felt so thin it was transparent. He sped back towards the cottage, the jeep skidding on the loose sand, a frantic prayer forming on his lips. It was his only hope. He remembered the grandfather's frantic scrawls, his increasingly desperate entries. There had to be something. Bursting into the cottage, Dean tore through his belongings, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He found the journal tucked beneath a pile of old charts, its leather cover feeling strangely warm beneath his trembling fingers. He ripped it open, flipping past the increasingly erratic handwriting, the desperate warnings, the half-formed theories. His eyes scanned page after page, searching for a pattern, a clue, anything. His gaze snagged on a section near the back, hastily written, the ink bleeding in places as if the grandfather's hand had trembled with fever or fear. It described a final, desperate measure. A ritual, not of summoning, but of containment. It spoke of a binding, of severing the tether, but the language was obscure, steeped in archaic metaphors. He pieced together fragmented phrases. The heart of the pack. A conduit must be offered. The sacrifice. A life for a seal. Dean read the words again, his mind struggling to comprehend the horror they implied. The ritual was incomplete, some crucial element missing, or perhaps intentionally omitted. But the implication was stark, undeniable. To seal the portal, to sever the entity's connection to this world, it required a terrible sacrifice. A life. His life? Or something even more unspeakable? The entity was coming, and the only way to stop it demanded a sacrifice he couldn't yet fathom. The island was no longer merely shrouded, it was dissolving. The fog, once a comforting veil, now pulsed with a sickly, phosphorescent glow, clinging to the crags and seeping into the very stone of the cottage. Dean watched from the grimy window, the glass rattling in its frame as the wind howled, a sound unlike any natural gale he'd ever heard. It was a lament, a monstrous exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of the deep. Rain, thick and oily, streaked down, tasting of salt and something metallic when it splattered against his lips. He'd stopped trying to map the changes. The coastline shifted daily, not by erosion, but by something far more sinister. Jagged new rocks, slick with an unknown, iridescent slime, jutted from the churning surf where smooth sands had once been. The few hardy plants that clung to the cliffs had twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves, their leaves unfurling into forms that resembled grasping fingers, their roots burrowing deeper into the earth as if seeking escape. The air itself hummed with a low frequency that vibrated in his teeth, a constant, unbearable pressure. Grief, once a suffocating blanket, had hardened into a cold, sharp shard in his chest, fueling a desperate resolve. He no longer sought solitude, he sought an end. The entity's tendrils were not just external, they probed his thoughts, whispering forgotten fears, weaving illusions at the periphery of his vision. He saw movement in the fog, shapes that dissolved when he focused, heard voices carried on the wind that were almost, but never quite, familiar. His grandfather's frantic script, once a riddle, now held a terrifying clarity. The seal requires a conduit, a vessel. Not merely blood, but the very essence of connection, forged in the liminal space. Where worlds touch. There, at the threshold, the barrier thins. To sever the pact, one must offer not a life, but a self. The personal cost. It wasn't just physical death, but a dissolution of identity, a sacrifice of his very being, his connection to the world he knew. To become the map. To be charted, not to chart. His grandfather hadn't merely documented a ritual, he had described a transformation, an ultimate surrender. Dean pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floorboards. He walked to the window again, peering into the swirling, phosphorescent fog. The old dock. He knew the place. A relic from a bygone era, long disused, its timbers rotting, its pilings half submerged. It was where his grandfather had once met the supply boat, where Dean himself had first stepped onto this forsaken rock. And now, it was to be the site of his final act. The border checkpoint. The island was a living thing now, its every groan and shudder a testament to the entity's growing power. He could feel it in the air, a thick, viscous presence that pressed against his skin, trying to seep into his pores. He gathered what he needed, the journal itself, his grandfather's heavy brass compass, its needle spinning wildly now, pointing to no true north, and a coil of thick, salt-encrusted rope. He strapped a waterproof satchel to his back, checking its contents, a worn flint, a small, wickedly sharp knife, and a flask of fresh water. These were mere tokens, he knew, against the enormity of what awaited him. The wind outside shrieked, a banshee's wail, and the cottage groaned as if under immense strain. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, the sound of splintering wood lost in the cacophony. He stepped out into the maelstrom. The path to the old dock was barely visible, swallowed by the unnatural fog and choked with the newly sprouted, grasping vegetation. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy in places, solid and slick with slime in others. He leaned into the gale, his head bowed, one hand clutching the journal to his chest. The journey was a gauntlet. The landscape warped around him. Twisted trees seemed to writhe, their branches scraping against each other with a sound like skeletal fingers. He didn't look directly at them. He couldn't. Finally, through a particularly dense swirl of glowing fog, the skeletal remains of the old dock emerged. Its timbers, once robust, were now encrusted with thick, barnacle-like growths that pulsed faintly. It was a place of departure, yes, but now it felt like a gateway, a membrane between worlds. Dean stood at the very edge of the dock, the rotting planks creaking under his weight. This was it. The border checkpoint. He was no longer just a cartographer, charting unknown lands. He was the offering. He was the sacrifice. He was the map. He was ready to pay the cost. The air thickened, pressing in on Dean's lungs as he pushed through the relentless, sodden fog. It tasted of salt and something else, a metallic tang beneath the brine, like ancient rust dissolved in the ocean's deepest trenches. The lighthouse, a spectral spire against the bruised sky, loomed closer, its beam a fractured, frantic pulse through the gloom. He clutched the rolled chart, the parchment feeling strangely warm in his trembling hand, a living thing. Determination, cold and sharp, had replaced the tremor of fear, though the terror still gnawed at the edges of his resolve. He heard it then, a sound that wasn't a sound. A pressure against his eardrums, an internal vibration that resonated with the very bones in his skull. It was the whisper of something vast, something moving beneath the island, a grinding shift of impossible weight. Reaching the base of the lighthouse, the wind howled a new language, filled with guttural clicks and sighs that mimicked human speech, yet were utterly alien. Water, not just spray but thick, viscous tendrils, streamed down the stone walls, leaving trails of iridescent slime. This was it. This was the border checkpoint. The threshold where his world ended and its domain began. Stepping through the heavy, barnacle-encrusted door, Dean felt an immediate, crushing descent, as if he'd plunged fathoms beneath the waves. The air grew heavy, damp, smelling of decay and something indefinable, like time itself turning to dust. Inside, the circular chamber was a maelstrom of distorted reality. The spiral staircase seemed to twist into itself, its steps leading nowhere, everywhere. The entity, or rather, its presence, was fully manifested now. It wasn't a creature with limbs or eyes, but a pervasive, all-encompassing wrongness. A kaleidoscopic shift in the very fabric of perception. Then came the psychological assault. Dean's mind was not his own. Images flashed, fragments of his past, his lost family, their faces distorted, screaming silently, his maps, meticulously drawn, now dissolving into inkblots, their lines unraveling into chaos. He saw himself, a tiny, insignificant speck on a vast, indifferent ocean, his identity dissolving, his very name becoming a meaningless sound. You are charted, the non-sound echoed, you are already mapped. This was the reveal. The entity didn't just want to enter his world, it wanted to become his world, to rewrite its very geography, starting with him. His grandfather's pact wasn't just to contain, but to feed a lineage of cartographers, each generation a new source of definition to be devoured, a new map to be unmade. He stumbled, clutching the chart tighter. His hands, his body, felt like they were dissolving, blurring at the edges. He knew this was the portal, not a gaping maw, but a breach in the conceptual boundary between worlds. With a guttural cry, Dean forced his shaking limbs to move. It was a map of the island, but not as it existed. It was a map of the island as it should be, a prison of lines and symbols designed to contain the ancient horror. He fumbled for the compass, its needles spinning wildly, uselessly. The inkwell, miraculously still upright on a small, warped table, seemed to sweat a viscous, black liquid. The entity's presence surged, attempting to overwhelm him, to make him forget his purpose, to lose himself in the ocean of its consciousness. He gripped the pen, its nib feeling like a shard of ice. He looked at the map, then at the swirling, impossible distortion at the center of the room. He understood. The sacrifice wasn't just his life, but his essence as a cartographer. He had to sacrifice his very connection to the world of lines and edges, to become a part of the boundary itself. He pressed the pen to the parchment, not drawing a line, but pressing a single, profound point into the heart of the map, a point that bled black ink. He felt his identity fraying, his memories becoming disconnected, like loose threads. The impossible shapes recoiled, the light flickered, and the crushing pressure momentarily intensified, then began to recede. The oily sheen on the floor convulsed, then slowly, agonizingly, tightened, shrinking back into itself. Dean gasped, his body trembling, his mind a fractured landscape. He had drawn the line, but at what cost? He looked at his hands, they seemed translucent, shimmering. The world around him, though still distorted, began to solidify, albeit in a slightly altered, less comprehensible way. The entity was retreating, but he was no longer just Dean. He was something else, something defined by the very act of defining, a living border. He felt a profound, aching emptiness where a moment ago a primal terror had clawed at his throat. The immediate threat, the one that had vibrated through the very stones of the island, had receded. He tasted salt, not just from the ocean, but from the raw, metallic tang that coated his tongue, a taste that had become intimately familiar in the crucible of the past few hours. His fingers, stiff and numb, traced the rough, damp stone of the lighthouse wall. He had pushed back, not with strength, but with a desperate, ancient understanding, an instinct that had bloomed from the terrifying knowledge he'd unearthed. His grandfather hadn't just been a lighthouse keeper, he had been a warden, a silent, solitary guardian tending to a pact far older than any man-made structure. Dean had inherited that burden, not just the cottage, but the duty. He hadn't defeated the deep song, he had merely appeased it. Sealed it, perhaps, for a time, with a ritual born of desperation and the island's own forgotten lore. The cost, he now realized, was not just measured in the sweat and fear that still clung to him like a shroud. It was deeper, more insidious. He began to walk, his legs moving with an automaton's precision, down the winding path away from the lighthouse. The fog, though lighter, still blurred the edges of his vision, making the familiar landscape seem alien, provisional. Every rustle of the sparse coastal grass, every distant cry of a gull, held a new, unsettling resonance. Internalized. His destination, though he hadn't consciously chosen it, was the only road leading from the lighthouse to the island's single, neglected dock. It was the only way off the island, the route a ferryman would occasionally take, if the weather permitted and the need arose. As he approached the stretch where the paved road gave way to a gravel track, a structure materialized out of the swirling mist. It wasn't the dilapidated wooden gate he remembered from his previous, fleeting trips. This was different. They weren't just fallen trees, they were interlocked, braced with rusting metal fittings that seemed to ride like tangled seaweed. At its center, a single, heavy chain, thick as a man's arm, hung taut between two posts, its links encrusted with barnacles and something else, a pale, phosphorescent growth that pulsed with a faint, internal light. This was a border checkpoint. There was no attendant, no guard, no sign to explain its purpose. Yet, Dean felt its presence like a physical pressure against his chest. It hummed with the same deep, resonant frequency he now perceived in the ocean, a silent demand. This wasn't merely a barrier, it was a threshold, a gate between what was and what now forever would be. A faint tremor ran through the structure, and the phosphorescent growth on the chain pulsed brighter, momentarily illuminating the ancient, waterlogged wood. He saw carvings on the timbers now, faint and almost eroded, but undeniably there. Not human script, but symbols that twisted and spiraled, mirroring the patterns he had seen in the ancient charts his grandfather had kept, charts that mapped not just currents, but the very flow of the deep song's influence. This checkpoint wasn't meant to keep anyone out. It was meant to keep him in. Or, perhaps, to mark his new territory. Not truly. Not without leaving behind a piece of himself he no longer possessed, or without betraying the silent, terrifying pact he had made. The immediate threat was neutralized, yes. The deep song would not rise, not yet. But Dean was no longer a reclusive cartographer seeking solitude.